Hello, welcome to another episode of No Franchise Fatigue, the podcast where we spend far too much time invested into one cinematic franchise, looking over all of the sequels, remakes, prequels, remakequels, and reboots to see how it all fits together and celebrate it. As always, I am joined by my quip-loving, disguise-wearing, and kung fu-kicking co-host, Sean Caylor. How are you doing this evening, good sir?
I am doing quite well, ready to take our orders from a mysterious voice in a box.
Which is funny coming from a podcast host. Considering our topic today, we felt it was necessary to grow from a duo to a most fitting trio. And thus we are joined by our first ever guest hostess and friend of the podcast, Thea.
Oh, very honored to be here.
Very honored.
Yeah, very, very honored to be your first on-air guest.
A trio of motherfucking angels.
Oh, that's great.
That was a good segue.
Yeah, how am I expected to follow that?
Yeah, you're not expected to. Nobody expected to follow that.
I'll go home.
Partially, yeah, no, not at this point. But, you know, that does lead us to our topic of the day, which is we will be talking about the cinematic version of the classic 1970s television show, Charlie's Angels.
Although, I do think it is worth noting in this specific case that the series has never been rebooted. It is actually a continuous through line from the 70s TV show.
Which is a fascinating portion of this. And we'll get into this a little bit later when we start talking about all the ridiculous cameos in these films. But so many cameos.
Some better than others.
Yeah.
Varying wildly in quality.
All of them wildly in quality. Every single one. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think it's a valid point to point out that as a 1970s TV show, I mean, this was obviously very popular, but the way that they approach this cinematic franchise right away is to not ignore it. It's not like I mean, they come out in this first film, and we'll get into it in detail, but they come out in this first film and they really talk about as if everybody understands what this is.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, and we'll get into it in a moment as we actually get into it, but it is fascinating that there is not an origin film in the bunch of them either. It does presume a basic knowledge.
Right. And I think it's a fascinating show to begin with because it was very much made for a specific demographic when it came out in the 1970s. And that makes it interesting to begin with. And it's fascinating that these movies, which start in the 2000s, in fact, 2000 for the first one, really try to just build on that as both a franchise that understands its audience, knows what it's talking about, but as one that wants to introduce a new younger audience to the same concept, which I think is kind of a good place to start. Is, you know, why don't we ask you, Thea, how did you find out about Charlie's Angels? I don't want to say how you got into it.
How did I become a fan of Charlie's Angels? No, that's actually a fair question because I was telling Matt earlier, I've never watched the Charlie's Angels TV show. I have no idea how it matches up tonally. I had no history going into it, but I was a 10-year-old girl who burned through my VHS copy of Charlie's Angels. Like this was my big like sleepover movie. When I was that age, like all my girlfriends would come over. My mom would have to call everyone else's moms to see if it was okay because it was PG-13. And for better or worse, like I loved that movie, and I came in with absolutely no previous knowledge of it. It's a really short 80 minutes to really become familiar with the entire universe. But I would say, you know, if you asked a lot of women my age that were 9, 10, 11 when it came out, I would say like a lot of people became like fairly fast fans of it. A lot of younger girls.
Whereas being just a touch older, my first experience with Charlie's Angels was the reruns as they used to play on things like TNT when I was a kid. So I had a passing familiarity with it, but it was never something I like went out of my way to watch. It's just something where if it was on, it was cool because, you know, it was a lot of punching and guns and things I was a big fan of.
And I mean, fair enough. I am too.
Legitimate definitely different versions of this throughout television and some version of this in every era. The 80s was basically Baywatch, 80s and 90s. They jokingly called it jiggle television, but what's funny is it did transcend that and was actually kind of a compelling little action show in its own right, which was kind of cool. My other weird origin with this and cinematically is this is actually the first movie I ever saw in theaters completely alone with my own money.
What? You were like, you literally were like, here's my $8. Like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go see it by myself. Like, seriously?
Yeah, absolute.
Ha!
What was it that compelled you on that specific Wednesday, or that you were just like, this is what, for the first time, this is what I'm going to do? Was it the cast? Was it?
Honestly, it was just gotten an argument with my stepmom, wanted to be out of the house, got my first paycheck from my first job, and movies were a very, very young love of mine. That's always kind of been my refuge. So it's just was the big premiere. And by the way, worth also noting, huge premiere. The first movie was a juggernaut.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's from what I had read, it was $93 million budget. The sucker did like 260 plus million in its box office run, which in 2000 is, it's a juggernaut.
Yeah, it was an absolute runaway. And how about yourself, Matt?
So in my household, as we've talked about on the podcast before, it was free range for movies. Like that was always something. And Charlie's Angels is actually a topic that usually kind of came up in our household. I've seen the TV show, not in a thorough way or anything. It's not like I've sat down and watched every season back to back or anything, but I've seen episodes throughout, my lifetime. So I was well aware of the Charlie's Angels TV show, even by the time that this movie came out. Now, I did not see this in theaters. I also saw it on VHS, rest in peace to that format.
Rest in pieces. VHS.
Why you gotta hate VHS, Sean?
My only regret about the death of VHS is the number of movies that never made the leap forward. Now that is a loss.
Oh, true. And as and it's funny because like my family, we still own a bunch of VHS because they have never been put onto DVD or Blu-ray yet. So
yeah.
But yeah, I watched it on VHS. I rented it from the video store. I remember at the time I didn't like it. It was not a movie that I had a nostalgic love for coming into it for this franchise review. But I feel like that it's an intriguing enough film to revisit now that we're literally 20 years down the road from this first film. And it's interesting to go back because it's, even on the watch that I had last week for it, the film acts as a weird time capsule in a lot of ways to what exactly was like popular in 2000.
Yeah, the movie lives so vividly within the year 2000. It's kind of incredible, especially like all of the outdated technology and references in particular. I thought were fantastic, and we can talk about that later. But specifically the line of Nokia phones that came out around that time, and that they actually had like a marketing campaign for related to the Charlie's Angels film. I tried to find some like old printouts because I remember seeing them in magazines when I was little, and I was like, I want one of those like blue Nokia phones, but unfortunately I couldn't find any.
Oh, worth noting, this actually also was an era before picture messaging was a thing, and that actually is a problem in the movie, interestingly. Well, we actually should just roll to the first movie because I'll even touch on that in a way more specific way in a second. But so, the first movie, as you said, coming out in the year 2000, Charlie's Angels is about three women who form a private detective agency backed by a millionaire named Charlie. And basically, they are trying to rescue a kidnapped tech millionaire whose technology can be used by a villainous Tim Curry to basically pinpoint anyone anywhere on the planet with just their voice and GPS satellites and, horrendous invasion of privacy, etc. But after they rescue the tech, they go on to realize that it was a double cross, the first of many in this franchise.
I was actually going to bring that up. I was like, man, every movie they're always wronged by people on the inside. Doesn't seem like a very tight organization, honestly.
But and
Charlie, what the hell are you running here?
Yeah.
they discover that Sam Rockwell, who plays the kidnapped, air quotes, tech mogul, was actually the son of a man who died in Vietnam, and he blames Charlie, who was like his father's best friend. Forgot to mention, we do definitely jump straight into spoilers in this show.
Damn it, Sean. We did it again where we didn't tell the people that we spoil things for them. Good job, Sean.
Oof. 2020 vision.
Please do not clap and point at me when you make bad puns. I refuse.
So, using his technology in this terrible pinpointy way, he does find Charlie and goes to attack him with a helicopter. And the girls save the day by reprogramming the missile to just spin around and shoot back at the helicopter, because that's how that works in any way.
It's the year 2000.
Yeah.
Technology is advanced. We are beyond the Matrix at this point.
Absolutely. No.
When you lay out the plot like that within 20 seconds, it actually sounds a lot more dense than how it feels when you're watching it. I'm like, wow, it sounds like there's a lot going on in this movie, which is kind of not how it feels, honestly. When
interesting about it, and I'm also gonna jump off the discussion here with things I liked about this movie. Because
nothing about this movie is good, Sean.
I didn't come into it with the most positive memories, if I'm being honest. But right off the bat, something I like about it is it's actually a 5-act story. It follows the structure of an 80s television show. It's also does something that I really, really loved right off the bat, which is it was common and is still common in the remakes of TV shows to do a faux intro like the old TV show. But very, very often they will use clips from a cold open or from later in the movie. Avengers was especially egregiously guilty of this. Something I really liked is they shoot unique material for the faux intro for this. It's just stuff for that sequence. I think that's kind of rad. But that said, this movie's also kind of worse than I remember at the same time, because it's just completely insane. Like, everything about it is insane. I will leave it to Matt to go on his rant about the music, but let's just say it's pervasive. I will also leave it to Matt, our resident Kung Fu expert, to go on to the world where everybody knows Kung Fu. But if I may touch on something negative specifically, it's that I think it's amazing that everybody in this movie is giving their all, but somehow Crispin Glover is, as the Thin Man, is both like the most incredible and most like cringeworthy thing about this movie at the same time. And it's really breathtaking to me, because for everything that's kind of cool about it, you have the scene where he's walking away from the club smoking a cigarette, and if you really watch it, he is mugging and smoking this cigarette with an intensity that is unnatural. Like, it's uncomfortable to watch. He's like fisting this thing and jamming it into his mouth and pulling it away and not even taking like a puff off the goddamn thing. And I'm like, what is happening?
There is a strange and unsettling sexuality to everything he does, and that's in this film.
It's true.
Which only gets weirder for the second film, but we will get to that in a minute. But I agree, Crispin Glover, who I love him as an actor. I mean, he has phenomenal range and things like that. And I think everyone, and to go with your point, Sean, that I will give the film that it is a film where everyone just leans into everything that they do. I mean,
we've even gotten this far without saying Bill Murray, who is brilliant in this movie, as he always is. He's hysterically funny.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting things, and this is actually how Thea ended up coming into this conversation, was I posted about this on Letterboxd, and I talked about that it's interesting that the 1970s TV show was very cheesy. And it very much plays up the cheesy aspect of it because it was the 1970s and it knew it needed to be a lot of fun if it was going to stand out against a lot of its peers on the television networks. And so it leans into the fun of everything. And this, as a film, is looking at that same concept through the lens of a 2000s film who wants to be self-referential to it. So it's almost like a double layered idea of cheese maxed out in a way. And as I'm watching it, I'm trying to remember if, when I first originally watched it, if I understood that's what it was doing. And I'm not sure that the film necessarily understands what it's doing. I'm not sure Mick G really knows that that's what the hell is going on in this film.
I will also point out that I can't believe we've gotten this far without mentioning famed music video director and executive producer of a personal favorite show of mine, Supernatural, and I will fight anyone on this, Mick G.
I was just actually going to bring up that I was unfamiliar with Mick G's past until I found out about all of his famed music videos, notably Sugar Ray's Fly. I did not realize that Mick G was friends with Mark McGrath in high school. And he actually wanted to front a band with him before realizing it wouldn't work out. So he became the producer of Sugar Ray albums as well as music videos, which he directed Smash Mouth's All Star, I believe. That's
the greatest music video of all time.
Yeah, which honestly makes so much sense because Charlie's Angels, it does seem like one long 80-minute music video, right?
Yep.
Like the visuals are very much in that same vein.
Oh, absolutely. And it's Mick G is known for his music videos, and he shoots the film absolutely. Thea, I think you're 100,000% correct on this. He shoots it like a music video, which also makes it completely ADHD and how it's edited. Like it's, and Sean, you mentioned that it does have that 5-act plot structure, which is really interesting. Except for I'm not sure the film knows that it has a 5-act plot structure. I think it just happened. It was kind of like, and the movie really just tries to really use its plot to thread to getting our 3 angels, who I'm sure we'll talk about in depth here with the casting with it, but to get our 3 angels from sequence to sequence, from gimmick to gimmick, whatever that might be.
Let us not forget, by God, costume to costume.
Yeah, it's I don't know if anyone's familiar with the show Charmed, but I feel like it is Charmed level of unrealistic hypersexual outfits. Lucy Liu cooking or baking in a corset specifically really takes you out takes you out of the moment, but she looks great. I mean, all 3 of them look great the whole time. I kept pausing the movie just to remark to my roommates how fantastic they all looked.
Extended dance sequence in your Spider-Man underwear.
Yeah, of course. Who could forget?
I was going to say, they give Cameron Diaz a lot of dance sequences in this movie, and Jesus, a lot of dance sequences in the second one.
Yeah, for how prominently it feels like all 3 of them definitely have their moments, but for how much Cameron Diaz feels like she's pushed, I would have thought that she was the one who'd purchased the rights to the film franchise rather than Drew Barrymore, because it really feels like she was front and center for so much of the franchise, which maybe, I'm not sure if she got top billing there or not.
I don't know, but that is actually a specifically interesting point because, Cameron Diaz, why am I losing her name in the movie? I just watched it.
Natalie.
Nat, yes.
God.
You just pulled that out like it was nothing. I'm sitting here, I'm like, what was her name?
Natalie, Alex, and Dylan are 3 heroines.
That's true.
This is why you're here, Thea.
No, that's okay. That's honestly all I'm good for.
But Natalie is an interesting character in the sense that she is very, very focal, and she takes the lead on a lot of things for someone that doesn't have much of a through line in either movie. They have the kind of romantic subplot with Luke Wilson, but that's also tertiary to the movie. They never build it. The characters that always just kind of click. It's love at first sight, which is sweet, but that's not an arc.
No, absolutely. And as you mentioned, Thea, it was Drew Barrymore who purchased the rights to these films and wanted to get these made. I mean, for the year 2000, having Cameron Diaz, Drew Barrymore, and Lucy Liu as your three leads is a really strong choice all the way around. Now,
and they're all having a lot of fun here, and they're all height of their powers here, technically.
Right. And this is actually, as Thea had mentioned about kind of the hypersexualized costumes and things like that. One of the reasons why I definitely wanted, to have you, Thea, on this episode, because as two men analyzing it, there's certainly a bias to what this has to offer in terms of, both as characters and like as a concept for Charlie's Angels. And I'm not sure, especially as I'm watching it, I actively hated that's how they treated it instead of, and this becomes a problem with all three of these films, I feel like. And the third one specifically tries to counteract this in some weird ways, but I feel like it's hypersexualized, and I'm not so sure in always empowering ways, like a female empowerment.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the film not really knowing what it's doing, or maybe pushing like conflicting messages. And again, I did not watch the original TV show, so I have no idea how this compares, but it does definitely feel like there is a simultaneous like self-aware sexism that it's pushing alongside this kind of like kick butt girl power message, right? So it's hard because I do have, especially loving this from when I was a kid, I do have a complicated relationship with the movies, and I kind of look at them the way I think about like the Barbies I played with growing up, right? Like, especially as an adult, I can go back and look at most of the imagery that was pushed upon me and realize, that there's absolutely some like internalized misogyny that came with that, or that some of those messages were damaging, but at the same time, just, you can't help but still have sort of like a fondness for them because they did seem fun. Like I said, I was, 10 years old while I was watching this, so I wasn't thinking about the fact that this was probably written by, what was it? I think they said that the script went through like 18 writers. I'm sure the vast majority of them men.
East, certainly.
Yeah, directed by a man. Of course I can look at it more critically now and pick it apart, and it does make it a lot harder to love, and rightfully so.
Wow.
But as a 10-year-old, it just kind of felt like girls for girls. That was, it was just me and a bunch of girlfriends watching it in a room, and I definitely processed it differently. So I'd say I have a complicated relationship with it. It's the only way I can sum it up.
Which, watching it recently, it's kind of what struck me too, is it's definitely, I feel like it's kind of a mixed message, because a lot of the story and a lot of the dialogue is actually really, really good, and it's sexually healthy. Dylan definitely owns her sexuality. She wakes up with one guy, sleeps with another guy in the course of one day. She wakes up with the Chad, and then she sleeps with the bad guy.
Well, we'll get to the Chad.
But all that said, like, it's shot by not just a man, but a music video director, so it's deeply male gazy. And I think that does give it kind of a confused message, a conflicted one.
Well, right. And I would even go to, as far as, like you said, the dialogue, there's some interesting lines in there where they talk about like, oh, I didn't expect a beautiful woman to be doing this. And then they're like, yeah, because everyone underestimates us, know? And then there's scenes where they'll play up kind of being ditzy, and then they'll speak in like 4 different languages in a span of 30 seconds.
Yeah. And there's the scene in the first movie where Cameron Diaz is taking on like 3 different men that she's fighting, like while she's trying to plan a date with Luke Wilson. And that feels like that's really all encompassing, like, of the message that it's trying to send, right? I feel like it's almost trying to be like for everyone. Like it is trying, it feels like kind of more of like a kick-ass version of what I think a lot of movies directed towards women were trying to push in the mid-aughts, which was like this, you can have it all sort of message, right? Like you can have like your badass career, and you can have like your great husband. It just kind of feels like another iteration of that in a way, if that makes sense.
I was actually vaguely reminded of another early aughts classic, and I will fight anyone on this, Josie and the Pussycats.
Oh, my first DVD that I ever owned, Josie and the Pussycats.
We can be friends. So like, but it does, there's a reminiscent quality there where it's kind of that early 2000s girl power feminism.
Yeah, and it makes for an interesting, and that's one of the reasons that, like, as I was rewatching this, I mean, I don't think I've seen this since probably 2003. I probably rewatched it in prep for seeing Full Throttle when I did watch it, because as a franchise person, that's what I do. I just rewatch everything as I go forward, and so I probably haven't seen it. So watching it as an adult, because at the time, I was young, I was in high school, and so as an adult, it's interesting to kind of look back at that and see what those messages are. And as I mentioned before, it's a time capsule of the 2000s in a very strange way, even in terms of themes. And I think it makes for an interesting approach to the film. I just don't think that the film handles it as well as it could have.
Yeah, and the more I think about it, they say the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And it feels like the movie presents this kind of watered down, really easily consumable version of like sex positive feminism, right? That honestly I don't think is that different from what we see today, which is this whole thing about, yeah, you can be empowered, you can do whatever you want, you can be sexy, but you should be sexy. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, you have the freedom to be sexy, but you should absolutely be sexy.
Which this film,
this film nails down to a T. They are all very sexy.
Yeah, in almost problematic ways in a lot of it, and to the point where, like, there's a sequence where they have to break in, and two of them are disguised as men, and then you have Lucy Liu who's disguised as this dominatrix, and you're like, okay, so there's a funny idea of them disguised as men that you could play around with as a comedic bit, and they almost do nothing with that portion of it, and then almost focus solely on the dominatrix jokes.
Right. Oh, which is too bad, because they make really good-looking men, and I would have liked to see that explored more.
On a strict scene-by-scene humor level, the fact that that scene evolves into Lucy Liu starting a work revolution is hysterically funny. It is one of the jokes that actually worked for me in the movie.
Oh, I think that's a great moment when she turns her knee in and she's like, "Can anyone tell me? Better yet, can anyone show me?" What? Yeah. That might be my favorite moment in the film.
I actually did find myself like legitimately chuckling at that.
I will admit, there's scenes that I openly laughed at, and there's a couple of them in here that, because the film, even more so than an action film, works as a comedy, and I think that was the intention of like leaning into it.
That's the thing I do find kind of interesting, because it's just strictly on the merit of comedy, which is not my genre of choice, which might explain why this isn't a favorite movie of mine. But like, judged as a comedy, this movie's kind of favorable. It's pretty funny.
Well, and this brings up an interesting point, because at the time period, I even took a note of this, because in the opening sequence of this first film, as they're on the plane, a fun cameo by LL Cool J. They're watching a movie on the plane that's TJ Hooker the movie, and it's played as a joke, right? Because he literally leans over and he's like, "Another movie from an old TV show," and it's played as a joke, but it's easy to forget that at the time, as they were trying to mine out old IP into films, that old TV shows were really popular at this time, including like Starsky and Hutch, and films like that. But almost all of them were turned into comedies, whether or not they actually started that way. Something like Dark Shadows is not. The show was very deadly serious, and they turned it into a comedy.
Although what's funny is it didn't work when they tried to take it seriously either, because Mod Squad was pretty dead serious, and that movie sucked.
Yeah, and let's, one of these times we'll have to do like a Good, Bad, Weird, Wild on Michael Mann, because I adore Michael Mann, but his Miami Vice movie is so divisive, and there's like things about it I love, but the fact that they like took it super, super dark and serious doesn't work either. But like,
also, it's 3.5 hours long, doesn't help anything.
No, but I'm not sold on the idea of turning all these into comedies either. Now, I think it actually works probably better here with Charlie's Angels, simply because of the cheesy nature of the show to begin with, and that it was meant to be kind of fun.
But, and the talent involved, which, we should at least mention the cast of this movie, which is insane. All three of these, actually, really.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're stacked casts. I mean, as you mentioned in your your synopsis, we're looking at a lot of different characters, including Bill Murray as Bosley here. We're looking at a Sam Rockwell who's playing it super serious in a way that's super funny, which is interesting. I mean, we have Tim Curry, who's always a delight to watch.
He puts on the sunglasses and does his little dance, does a split and lights a cigarette. That is such a great moment.
I used to rewind that scene a lot as a young woman.
Was that a little awakening?
Oh yeah. I love to watch Sam Rockwell dance. He's a great dancer.
He's a pretty good dancer. So many dance sequences in this movie.
Well, and it goes to the comedy portion of this, is that it's very presentational. Like, it's not representational, it's presentational. It's like a musical in many ways, the way it's shot, like a music video. And so, like, even like a lot of these side characters, Tom Green is in it shortly. You had mentioned the Chad before, and I told you we're going to talk about the Chad. So here's the Chad. It's played by Tom Green. He shows up essentially as a visual punchline in a lot of ways, with him cooking breakfast and dropping things in the ocean, including himself.
And I'll go ahead and admit that. So I missed Tom Green's cultural moment. I know that there was a while where he was everywhere. I actually have never seen him in anything except for this film. So maybe someone can get me up to speed on why he was everywhere for a little bit.
Tom Green had this moment in the late 90s where he had something called The Tom Green Show on MTV. Where he came from before that, I've got no clue. Don't care to know. He seemed to just walk.
Don't care to know. Tom Green.
But his whole shtick was that he would do anything for a laugh. So he would like go to a cow farm and then get under the cow and suck its teat
just
to pull milk
himself
straight out.
For comedy.
Completely. And that was his style of humor, and that does carry through to this movie. This movie was literally a Tom Green show bit. Him just like falling off the boat, just cartwheeling himself off the boat or getting himself stuck in the smokestack. That's absolutely a Tom Green bit, and that is what they considered funny in the late 90s. This is why Matt and I are not comedy fans.
Do you think Tom Green's ears are burning somewhere because this is the most that anyone's talked about him in years?
Tragically inaccurate. Podcasting king Tom Green.
Oh, our competitor.
Quite well for himself.
He just like perks his head up and he's like, "Daddy, would you like some sausage?" And he starts playing the piano.
Oh, seriously, one of very few movies in my life I've ever walked out on.
Really? You walked out of Freddy Got Fingered?
Hate that movie.
I mean, I hate the movie too, but I didn't walk out on it.
Hate that movie. Tom Green infuriates me. This is not a great subject to focus on.
I'm sorry. And honestly, the moment that the Tom Green question left my mouth, I was like, oh, this is probably not something we should be wasting our time on. I'm assuming he was just cast because he was in the room with Drew Barrymore while she was talking about working on this film, because I know they were dating at the time, correct?
For some reason, she loved that mad Canadian fool. Like, she was in his movie, he was in her movie. That's just how it was. I don't know if you recall, but yes, she does have a little cameo in Freddy Got Fingered.
Yeah, we let's forget about Freddy Got Fingered. Let's move on to talk about
the Freddy Got Fingered franchise.
No, let's not. The Freddy. Yeah. What movie should have been franchised? Freddy Got Fingered. No, go screw yourself. Anyway, so no, I think, but I mean, this cast is stacked in general. I mean, even Matt LeBlanc, who at this time would have been writing High on Friends, shows up as the love interest for Lucy Liu's character, Alex. Am I right on that?
You are correct. Yeah, and I thought Matt LeBlanc was a joy to see. I'm glad they let him off the Friends lot to do this.
No, and he is very funny. Like I said, actually, all of my complaints and everything I don't like about this movie, we can really just say action. Because, like, the cameos are delightful. The jokes, honestly, by and large, kind of work for me. I think the dialogue's fine. It's a fun movie. It looks like it was edited by somebody having a seizure. There we go.
Yeah. And that's the thing about like Mick G is that, to this day, I'm a weird apologist for Terminator Salvation, but outside of that, and nobody outside of me likes that movie, but, a lot of I don't know if he's ever really had like a huge following. I mean, these movies did money.
All
There are
those
no McG loyalists out there.
Not that I know of.
famous on-set freakouts. McG doesn't seem to have much grasp on controlling his cast either, because Charlie's Angels did have a famous on-set blow-up between Bill Murray and Lucy Liu. Apparently, they hated each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's funny because even that there's like all these rumors about that blow up, about what that actually was, or whether or not. And Bill Murray came out and was like, it wasn't about Lucy Liu, it was about how stupid that fucking movie is. Which I'm like, wow, that's actually believable because that movie's so fucking stupid. But it's interesting because this movie, there was a lot of tension at times with it, and with the cost of everything. I get it, and I get that Bill Murray obviously doesn't show up in the second one, and we'll talk about that because that's a really awkward situation. But he's in this movie, and you can tell he's given it his all. He's kind of given free reign to kind of improv what he needs. But
with McG and contemporary music video director Michael Bay and their awkward 90s/aughts race humor.
Oh, it's just terrible. And actually, like, I even wrote a note about that in this one, is that there's a sequence in here where Tim Curry is fighting Bill Murray in inflatable sumo suits. And then later on, Cameron Diaz is on Soul Train.
Yeah. Both of those instances are like the 10th most offensive things to happen in Charlie's Angels, right? It is
also quote the line, "Oh, look, that white girl can dance."
Yeah, there's rampant instances of cultural appropriation at best and full-on tasteless racist caricatures at worst, right? Like they're all over this film.
Even enough so that there's like a joke where LL Cool J's in the plane in the beginning and they won't let him up to first class.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, this is like the first like 5 minutes, and I'm like as I'm watching it, I'm like, boy, this is gonna be a long 98 minutes.
Yeah, or when you have Lucy Liu as masseuse, and then you have Cameron Diaz and Drew Barrymore in their like traditional get-ups while the song "I'm Turning Japanese" plays in the background. That was one that really stuck out to me.
So brutal.
That intro scene is also walks that edge of the blackface conversation. Although it was the year 2000, what was it with spy movies and face masks that year? Because Mission Impossible 2 was too many face masks.
Well, and part of that is the original Mission Impossible TV series, and I actually have a note of that this film, and particularly the second one, pull heavily from Mission Impossible to the point where, like, in the second one they even spoof Mission Impossible 2.
The poster for Matt LeBlanc's Maximum Extreme, or whatever the hell that franchise is called, it directly mimics the Mission Impossible 3, I think, poster.
Yeah, and so like there's very much an influence because the first Mission Impossible would have been out at that time and was very popular. So I'm guessing that, and going into this, I do want to talk about this here in a second. You had mentioned like the action and stuff, that this movie rips off a lot of things. In trying to be its own thing, it just rips off on other things, almost to the point it kind of felt like a spoof film at times. And in the action sequences in particular, they're all done using wuxia wire fu, which was made popular by The Matrix just the year prior. And in fact, enough so that the makers of this film went and got out Yu Wu Ping's brother to do all the action choreography for this one, which in a way is kind of fun because it's so over the top and silly. I mean, I never thought I'd see Crispin Glover in like a wuxia sword fight with a cane sword, but
Lord
we got
knows,
fucking one here. It's ridiculous. And everybody knows martial arts, and some of it's fun, some of it doesn't work. It's very silly, but it's worthy to note that this was, ripping off the Matrix style in a movie that doesn't have it gets away with it in the Matrix because you're bending the rules of physics, which is what allows them to do these kind of wuxia flying through the air, stunts and whatnot. That was really popular in 90s Hong Kong cinema.
Well, if the Matrix bent the rules of physics, McG declares open war on them in this movie.
Fair enough.
I think my favorite unrealistic stunt was when LL Cool J is able to jump out of that plane at 30,000 feet just by opening the emergency exit door.
Literally can't believe no one mentioned that before, because yeah, holy shit, that's literally how the movie opens. He just whips the goddamn thing open like it's nothing.
Yeah, which again, like for years, I thought that that's maybe how doors worked in planes before I realized that, the pressure, of course, would prevent that from happening. But yeah, just opens it up like it ain't no thing, just jumps right out. So I hope the rest of that commercial flight went okay. I hope they're alive.
That's what I was just thinking. I was like, man, if you managed to get that door open, you just slaughtered all these innocent people in the meantime to catch a bad guy who has a bomb anyway.
Just went down in the Atlantic.
It's so ridiculous. But
by the way, speaking of the cavalcade of weird cameos, a bomb being worn by Sean Whalen.
Oh shit, that's right. That was Sean Whalen. I was writing down all the cameos and I missed that one.
Recently rewatched People Under the Stairs, so it was fresh in my mind.
That's so funny. But yeah, I mean, this movie does that. And then you mentioned it before, and I have to mention it. One of the things that irritated me the most about this film was how many needle drops it has. As I mentioned before, I wasn't sure if there was actually a score to this movie, because it even like sequences, like the opening sequence, it opens up with the first part of Korn's song Blind. And I was like, oh, we're starting off with Blind, but it never actually uses the song. It just uses that as like part of the score. And I was like, did you just pay an exorbitant amount of money to fucking Korn just to play that bass line?
And since we opened up the music conversation, I also found it really, really fascinating that not only does this movie have a score, but it also reuses the song Smack My Bitch Up almost every time Crispin Glover's on screen, making it ostensibly his theme in the movie.
The Thin Man's theme.
Smack My Bitch Up. I didn't notice that, but that's amazing.
Yeah, no, there are things about this movie that are so cool, and then any of the action sequences, it almost pulls me out because it hits that weird middle ground where if it leaned more into being an action movie, it would be mediocre but fun action. But it's like it draws you out of the comedy and everything that's happening. But if you're trying to treat it like an action movie, then all the comedy that's happening draws you out of everything. And it's just like you say, it's muddled. The whole movie is just kind of muddled.
And to the point where like at the very end, we get like shots of like the outtakes and with them all laughing and everything. And so you get this idea that that's what this movie is supposed to be, is fun, right? That's what this movie is supposed to be. And unfortunately, like as I'm watching it, like I'm not sure I literally had fun. And I think it was because I was trying to make sense of it all. Like I sat there and I was like concentrating really hard.
That's having that much fun and then expects you to take seriously that Lucy Liu and Crispin Glover are playing chicken in F1 cars on the Golden Gate Bridge.
Fair enough. But like then again, like with Crispin Glover, I'd buy into anything. I'm like, I'd buy into it. Like Crispin Glover is the best, hands down. Crispin Glover is the best part of this movie, as far as I'm concerned.
I would say Crispin Glover, but also neck and neck for me is just the chemistry between the three leads. I really like all three women in this film, and I think that they're good in it, and I think that they're so damn charming.
They do like they're actually having fun with it.
Yeah, like. I don't know. I can't picture anyone else in those roles. Like they really take me through it from beginning to end. Like I have fun with them. So I would say, but between the four of them, they're definitely the best part of this franchise.
And one last note on the cast, and something I did find kind of interesting is, well, not last note. You said you grabbed a bunch of the cameos, but John Forsythe, who was the original voice of Charlie in the show, in what I said earlier about this never rebooting, is actually the voice of Charlie all the way through too.
Right. And I think, yeah, kind of rolling back and segueing us into the second film, but it's interesting that this film like literally does, it just runs with the idea of this Charlie's Angels, and we get more of that in the second film, which makes it even more intriguing, particularly as we get into the slash reboot that just happened here in 2019, because that makes it even weirder. But we'll get into that. But I actually think this is a great segue to get us into the second film, Charlie's Angels Full Throttle.
Okay, so I was asked to write a short synopsis for Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, but instead of doing that, I really wanted to just read the back of the VHS box, talking about Rest in Pieces, because I think this does a great job all on its own. They're back, they're hot, and they're kicking serious butt. So lest we forget that they are still hot. Cameron Diaz, Drew Barrymore, and Lucy Liu are dazzling in this action-packed sequel that's even sexier, funnier, and more spectacular than the original. Aided by trusty sidekick Bosley, Bernie Mac, these gorgeous angels will stop at nothing in battling Angel Gone Bad Madison Lee. A huge spoiler. Am I right? Like, that's in the last, 25 minutes of the movie that we find out that she is the villain. Like, maybe it was, thinly veiled, but regardless, I think that's a little rude of the VHS box to do. Burning with attitude and sex appeal to spare. So this is like the fourth time we've been told that they're sexy. The Angels put the pedal to the metal in a do-or-die pursuit that never slows down. Directed by McG and featuring brilliant performances by Luke Wilson and Crispin Glover, plus a host of killer cameos and a jammin' soundtrack. Charlie's Angels Full Throttle is an all-out, heart-stopping thrill ride of a movie. Really a brilliant performance by Luke Wilson. That's what I take the most issue with.
So,
the way you said Bernie Mac kills me.
It's right there in little parentheses. But essentially, in this sequel, the list of people on the federal witness protection program list has been divvied up into two pieces of jewelry, two rings that two different men wear. And essentially those two rings have been stolen or they're attempting to steal them so that they can slowly knock off everyone on that list. Did I do an okay job?
Great job. You did a great job. I actually think one of the biggest mistakes anyone ever made was trusting half of this list to the T-1000.
And the other half to Bruce Willis.
Bruce Willis, he does not put up much of a fight. He's taken out very easily.
It's almost like his acting career now.
Yeah. And again, I was telling Matt earlier, I assume Bruce Willis was here because he was in the room when Demi Moore was talking about the movie. I feel like that's how half the men got here.
I'm sure they were divorced before this.
Yeah, they maintained a friendly relationship then, so she probably just texted him and was like, "Hey, Bruce,
you got to babysit my other husband."
Yeah, exactly.
No, my favorite thing about that scene is Bruce Willis's wig, because it's like,
oh, it's a bad wig.
It's such a bad wig.
I could host a whole podcast just on wigs and movies.
And that's bearing in mind, I just revisited Sin City this morning while I was editing a little bit. I'm like, oh shit, that's a bad wig too. Man, Bruce Willis went through some bad wigs. I'm glad he just gave up and went bald.
See, well, and I kind of wish that he, for certain characters, would just grow out his hair and like do a comb over, because I think it fits his personality as an actor now.
You remember his wig in The Jackal?
Okay, so his wig is obviously terrible in The Jackal. That movie's awesome, though, Sean. I will not hear bad about The Jackal.
Oh, I got nothing bad to say. That scene with Jack Black and the cigarettes.
That we can get off on a whole tangent about how awesome The Jackal is.
That has a remake, though. We can actually do that for this podcast someday.
Yeah, and I love the original film too, so it's all good. So yeah, we'll put that in our back pocket. But yeah, so once again, we are led here to Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, which, by the way, I just want to note that's a stupid title. Why is I don't which
I believe they do reference, right, within their own film when they're making fun of Matt LeBlanc's franchise, and they're talking about how the first one, I can't remember if they say if it was good or bad, because it had like 12 writers, which of course making fun of the fact that the original film had so many writers. And then they make fun of what it's called, like Maximum Force, like All In or something, or I can't remember what they call it, but they take a little jab at themselves with that.
Yeah, and I think, boy, I'm just gonna lead off on this one with something I really hated about this movie. That motocross scene is so painful to watch.
I only wrote 2 notes for this movie, and one of them is Crispin Glover on a dirt bike is really funny.
No, where I start really losing it because the color grading is nauseating. Like I don't know who color graded this scene specifically, but it has this weird neon halo effect that I realized was to try and mask out the fact that there's very little real motocrossing going on. But
Right, with
regardless,
so much green screen.
it leaves it with this, but they try and blow out the color to cover it, and it leaves it with this nauseating look first and foremost. But also, if the first movie murdered physics, the assassin popping off, flipping upside down, pulling out two guns, shoot, 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 and then he gets back on the bike and lands. I don't know what Isaac Newton did to McGee, but Jesus, let it go, dude.
When I don't know what you're talking about, I did that yesterday.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's something I commonly do, Sean. That's how it goes. And going back to Thea's point with notes, like as I was taking notes for this, they just increasingly get more angry and more in caps, and they're all questions. All of my notes are questions about this movie that I do not have answers for. Like literally my first note is opening Indiana Jones knockoff. How does Lucy Liu open the crate from being upside down if she can't unscrew the bolts?
And again, why does the opening of this movie seem so much like a Pirates of the Caribbean sequel?
It's the Mongolians. Well, there's like 4 languages spoken. There's like Mandarin, Mongolian, Russian, and everything.
Whatever Cameron Diaz is doing.
She's riding a mechanical bull, all in white.
Fist fighting in this movie, weirdly. We're still in the era of wire fu in Hollywood, but they amped up the guns for whatever reason.
Enough so that it becomes a plot point where Demi Moore's like, I always use guns.
Yeah.
And you're like, great. I'm like, thanks. I'm like, I don't know what that, and then it becomes a plot point later on, and you're like, well, shit, I guess that was supposed to be not a joke.
But like this movie is just crazy. There's the Irish mobster. There's the Shia LaBeouf of it all.
The Shia LaBeouf of it all.
That's our new catchphrase, the Shia LaBeouf of it all. Yeah, I mean, again, like we talk a lot about casting in the last one, and we might as well just start there, like before we even get into the themes or plot or anything, because once again, this one's stacked down to the point where, like, even the motocross scene, the like leader of the motocross is pink.
I'd completely forgotten about that. I was like, wow, she acted? Well, acted?
Nope, she didn't.
You have to imagine.
Seconds, and then we cut her song in there for a little bit. She did okay.
Wait a second. Actually, what do you want to bet McGee directed a Pink music video?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. You have to believe it. But I mean, like, you need to look that up. You should look that up. But let's talk about again, as I was going through this movie, I just started listing this cast. So Bernie Mac comes in to replace Bill Murray as the new Bosley, who ironically also plays his brother, ? We have Shia LaBeouf comes in, like you said, the T-1000 Robert Patrick. Crispin Glover returns for whatever reason. I mean, he was the best part of the first one, so I can't really complain there.
He has really upped his beauty game for this film. His skin is just pale white, lots of powder on it. His eyebrows are so thin.
Thin man.
Yeah.
And his screech is at a whole new level in this one.
Okay, so there's a few scenes, like in the first one, I really openly laughed at when Lucy Liu's like van gets shot up and explodes. Like that scene for whatever reason like got me to laugh. In this one, it was the flashback to Crispin Glover as a child, and then like he just starts screaming at the haircut, and then like 2 seconds later they flash back to Crispin Glover as an adult because he comes back to get a haircut, and his screech at that moment, like I had to pause the movie.
Getting a haircut by Queen Carrie Fisher.
It's so funny. Like I laughed. It was so good.
Yeah, incredible moment in time.
Yeah, cinematic gold at that point. But I mean, yeah. So Crispin Glover is back. Bruce Willis, as we talked about, Matt LeBlanc is back. Luke Wilson is back. Robert Forster, rest in peace. I love me some Robert Forster. He shows up here. John Cleese plays Lucy Liu's dad.
No need to explain that. Just sure.
Whose only purpose in this movie is to be confused about her profession because he thinks she's a prostitute.
By far, the joke that hits like the least for me is that one. It lasts so long. It's just absolutely terrible from beginning to end. But I believe that he gave birth to her.
I think You are very brave calling that a joke.
Yeah, it's just torture at this point where you're like, it just keeps going too. As we mentioned, Demi Moore, there is uncredited by the Olsen twins, shows up as a potential future Charlie's Angels.
Okay, that bit's kind of funny.
Yeah, with hers being really old in the center and the Olsen twins next to her. Yeah.
Although, boy, that old age makeup was not very good.
No, not at all. And I'm not, again, because this movie leans so hard into comedy, half of the shit that happens, I'm not sure if it's on purpose or not. Like the bad green screen, I'm not sure if it's meant to be that way.
But again, touching on the action, and it's notably worse in this movie, first and foremost. So however you felt about the action in the first movie, it's definitely taken a step down in this one. It's less kinetic. Bullets have a weird magnetic quality. When she shoots the three angels off the roof is just like, what is happening here?
I love the action in this film when they that explosion happens and they all manage to find pieces of like wood so they can like surf down that rope. I legitimately love the action in this film. I don't know what you guys are talking about. It doesn't need to make sense.
Fair enough. I actually wrote a note and I was like, the last car chase with Demi Moore, after they ride the boards on and then they proceed to like kind of glide in and chase the car and they all land on the car. That car wreck at the end of it where it's CGI and it looks like a matchbox car when a kid like throws it across the room. Like I was like openly laughing so hard. I was like, this is potentially the worst and greatest car wreck of all time.
Like, so the scene where Lucy Liu attaches herself to Robert Patrick's car and they're just driving, and what is even happening in that scene? Like, how is she tapping into his cell phone?
Don't ask questions, Sean. This is full throttle. Like when you are driving at 100 miles an hour, can you see anything? The answer is no. You cannot see anything. Your vision is now slower than the speed you're going.
Yeah, I just watched this movie like 3 hours ago, but already I'm feeling foggy on the details with regards to that.
Well, and that's just kind of the thing about this one is it was frivolous. It seems to have had the same energy and everybody still seems to be having fun, but like just nothing about this one really works. I still found myself laughing, which is why I'll still give this the better than I remember and worse than I remember kind of thing. And I'll still say that about it because I definitely did have a couple of chuckles, although none of which were Bernie Mac. He is a blight on this movie. His family's actually pretty funny. I like his mom.
He's a blight on this movie. So I sincerely do not understand why they chose to, like, you could have easily just had him be the new Bosley. Like, that's not a hard thing. But then the film makes, and going back to your point about you're not sure, this film does a lot of the same things. I actually think that this film has the worst parts of sequelitis, where it wants to do everything bigger, faster, bolder in a lot of ways, but it chooses all the wrong things to do that with, including the action or the comedy or, even the outfits that these girls are forced to be put into for this, or lack of outfits. Cause I guess the one scene where they're put in the statue, they have to be naked in the statue, which that was a question I wrote in. Do they have to be naked in the statue? But I think that this movie does all the things the wrong way. And that includes replacing Bosley with Bernie Mac, where at the beginning of it is the Angels explaining Bosley his own job. Like, how the fuck did you get this job, Bosley?
Right. Like the Bosley is not a job that you have to interview for. It's just like a family legacy. Like now that Bill Murray has passed on, ?
And Shia LaBeouf will now be the new Bosley?
Oh, okay. See, I missed that little detail. I must have ran to the bathroom for that.
Now that Bosley is not a position you interview for yet. We'll get there.
That's super funny.
But no, but on top of what you're saying about the sequelitis, it's so much worse with the needle drops too. I'm not even going to count per scene. I'm just going to mention I took specific note when the music credits at the end of this start running. It is a full minute of music credits. and this movie had a score. What?
It's ridiculous. It's to the point where like I got super irritated. I got irritated with the first one, and I really got irritated with this one. I was just like tone it back. Like you do not have to put music, like a recognizable song in every scene. You don't have to do it, McG. It's okay to not do that and like actually have a score. And like you said, the movie has a score. I'd be fucked if I remember it.
It's pretty generic.
Well, at times it's like there's like some funky stuff that happens. Like you said, there's a lot of dance sequences and things like that.
Boy, this movie doubles down on that. I know I mentioned it before, but there is like an actually notable number of dance sequences in this movie. It's practically a musical.
And I hate musicals. We already know this.
I was going to say, I also think that aspect of the film works. I do enjoy that. Maybe it is just because it feels like a much longer music video than the second one. The first one is mercifully short, right? It's like 79 minutes. It's barely legally a movie. And this one's quite a bit longer.
This literally opens with the three girls dancing to Hammer Time.
Yeah, no, I think that's cute.
Actually, that was like the one scene I think I really liked in this, outside of Crispin Glover's flashback. But the scene with them where they flip the couch and then she like jumps the couch and face plants it, like actually got an open laugh out of me. And I thought, well, it's as you mentioned, Thea, in the first one, that they have a really strong chemistry. And I think it's probably, for me, one of the only reasons that this film is coherent at all. Outside of how much this movie tries to sexualize them, like the burlesque sequence is like teeth grinding bad. Like I like don't even understand.
And I don't know why this is the scene. Like I just got done defending like all of the crazy dance sequences, right? But for some reason that's the one that really takes me out, because I'm like, okay, first they had to just like just pretend that they were hired amongst all of these other strippers, or I'm sorry, burlesque dancers. Like they all learned the routine. It's very coordinated. In particular I had a lot of questions about.
Also, I don't know if you've ever been doused with champagne, but I would not jump up and go, woo. It's Joker plan syndrome, where they're banking on things you couldn't possibly know would happen.
Right. Yeah, of course. And the whole like sexy lady, hapless idiot man is really like especially dialed up, right, in a lot of these scenes.
Well, because it's the Mystique seducing the guard in X2 writ large, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, as I said, like this movie tries to do everything bigger, longer, faster, harder. That includes like how, like in the first film, I could even potentially defend it as like that girl empowerment thing. And this one, by the time I get through to it, I even wrote down a question. I was like, okay, so I feel like there's themes about toxic relationships, past trauma, and a system, which includes the Charlie system, that uses women, that's like a smattering of an idea that is completely overlooked to try to appeal visually.
Yeah, and any of that I feel like was just accidental.
Yeah, because like even Demi Moore's like, the system used me, and she has a line in this, and I wish I could remember the line in full, but where she's talking to Charlie, and Charlie is like, but you were so good, and she's like, I wasn't good, I was great. And I think that was an interesting line, because there's this idea that like she was never appreciated for how good she was at her job. But then like the scene before it or after it, she's in her bathing suit and a fur coat, and you're like, what are you doing, movie? Like, make a decision.
Yeah. I mean, no, yeah, that's all true. I don't know if the movie, really obviously never commits to any of those themes, right? Just kind of hints at them for no real purpose, right? Like Demi Moore's given like the flimsiest excuse ever to go to the dark side, just that she wasn't appreciated enough. Like, oh man, once again, Charlie does not run a very tight ship.
They do specifically say she had always been a poor team player too. Mm-hmm. Which I think is more thematically what they were jabbing at her, but it's like, so you mean she was too good at it?
It doesn't work. It doesn't, like, there's, at the end of this episode, we always like to try to talk about themes between these movies, and we'll talk a little bit about feminism and things like that. But I feel like this movie's kind of void of all of that, to the point where, like, even as we mentioned at the end of the first film, there is a sequence of outtakes where they kind of show the charm and everything. This one is interspersed with the girls dancing in a car wash. Mm-hmm. And you're like, what is this?
It's an actual Carl's Jr. commercial.
I forgot about the Carl's Jr. course. God, I hate modern society sometimes.
Speaking of modern society, I heard there's a third one of these.
Yeah, as much as we all hate it. No, there is a third one. And actually, it's the third film, which is, I think, the reason why, because we had multiple requests to cover the Charlie's Angels franchise. And I think part of that had to do with this new film being released. Because it was a film that, I mean, it got released and it bombed so badly in theaters that I'm pretty sure that they'll just bury this eventually. Like, this film will be one that kind of ceases to exist. It'll be a movie that everyone forgets. People will remember Charlie's Angels and Charlie's Angels Full Throttle for being the fun, bad movie. And I think this latest one will be kind of never remembered at all, which is both a blessing and a curse in a lot of ways, because there's some interesting ideas in this one. But yeah, why don't we just jump into this one? So here we have a new set of Charlie's Angels, and it exists in the same world as the last two. And this is evident in one scene that we'll talk about in a little bit. But we're introduced to the entire Charlie's company, where there's multiple Bosleys. You actually get to see that there's like all these Bosleys that are around, things like that. Elizabeth Banks plays one of these Bosleys. She's kind of tasked with running this task force of these new Charlie's Angels. So the film there's a new device that is being built, because as it turns out, all the Charlie's Angels movies have to be about technology that's going to be really dated soon. But this is about an energy conservation device that ends up can be utilized as a weapon. And so the Charlie's Angels are tasked with going in to discover the weapon, to help out with it, to find it, to, get rid of it at one point. Eventually they go across, they end up getting double crossed 1,000 times everything. Cause as Thea has mentioned, Charlie runs a real loose ship over here, and we get a lot of that in there. I mean, it's a movie that has real thin plot in terms of actually getting anywhere with anything. It's a basic spy plot where you have a MacGuffin, which is this technology. You have the team, which they are recruiting a new Charlie's Angels member to be part of the team. So you have the two of the main Charlie's Angels that are in it. They recruit the new one. She's learning as she goes. She plays the audience surrogate for it. They literally just go through the motions with this film, and then it just kind of ends in a kind of a random reveal for who the actual villain is. And I mean, I wish I could say more about the plot, but there really isn't. There's not a lot going on here. I mean, we can talk about, like, there's a romantic love interest that's involved in there. We get a lot of double crossing where we start to think certain characters are evil when they're not, and certain characters that are good that are evil. It's kind of your classic, going back to the Mission Impossible comparison, something like a Mission Impossible movie might be, where the girls end up having to go rogue. I mean, it's a pretty bland plot overall.
So I'm going to defend the sanctity of this franchise real quick. The show is called Charlie's Angels. The detective agency is Townsend Agency. It's the Townsend Agency, because his name's Charlie Townsend.
Huh. Like, I do not remember that from the original TV show. I really could have. You could have fooled me with that.
The TV show too. Sorry, I was half kidding. I wasn't actually trying to actually there.
No, that's legit. That's fair enough. So, but once again, here with Charlie's Angels 2019. So obviously the second Charlie's Angels film, I mean, Full Throttle does a lot of money. We talked a little bit about box office for the first one, and we didn't really for the second one. It makes a lot of money. The franchise goes into hibernation, partially because I think it was so critically panned that eventually, I think the company saw that there would be,
There actually plans to do a third one in that particular group of them, but it did all fall through, like, famously, and not in any particularly explosive way, but exactly like you say, like, interest dwindled, and the whole TV revival thing of the early aughts kind of died down too.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we are in an age of weaponized nostalgia, where we can, it makes perfect sense that they would want to bring back Charlie's Angels now for this audience in 2019 for a few reasons. And so even when it was announced, I don't want to say I was excited. I was semi-interested and intrigued by it, because we are living in a time where you could say something interesting with a female cast, with an espionage. You can say something interesting by hiring Elizabeth Banks to write and direct this movie. You can say something interesting because you can speak to two demographics, one who remembers the original TV show, and then one who remembers the 2000 movies. Because as we said, we're almost 20 years past the original Charlie's Angels. So we have people that are in their mid-20s or early 30s who remember this from their childhood. So we have an interesting idea for this film to be built on. And when I went and saw it, I was almost devastated by how brutally it misses the mark on almost everything.
I certainly agree. What did you think, Thea?
Actually, I have not seen this film. In preparation for recording this, I tried my darndest to find it, but yeah, I haven't actually been able to watch it yet. So I'm curious to get your guys' opinions, but I am still very interested in seeing it, despite the real lackluster response to it. Right? That almost makes me. I don't know. I'm a fan of the underdog. This almost makes me want to support it. Like I don't revel in the fact that it bombed. It makes me pretty sad. I don't like Elizabeth Banks as a director. She famously directed my least favorite film of all time, Pitch Perfect 2. But I did want this to do well. I'm also a big fan of Kristen Stewart. I think that she's good in stuff. I think she's a good actress. I wanted to support this movie, but I have not gotten around to seeing it yet.
You or anybody else. The movie did $8 million its opening weekend, which is like bafflingly low.
No, yeah, Matt and I are definitely the statistical anomalies here. I think my biggest problem with the way this movie bombed is the same problem I always have with that kind of stuff, which is the wrong people take the wrong message from it. And they're like, well, a female-led action movie will never do it. And obviously that's getting proven wrong over and over and over again. And you know what? Women-led movies are allowed to have bad movies too. Christ knows. Reb Brown had a whole fucking career on it.
This is true. And I don't, and even though I don't like this movie, and we'll get into more about kind of the reasons why here in a second, even though I don't like this movie, there's, again, interesting pieces to it. And
Kristen Stewart, I actually think, is notably good in it. I think she's the only one that's notably good in it, but she is actually really pretty fun in this movie.
Well, and I would like to point out that I'm also a Kristen Stewart apologist in a lot of ways. I actually quite like a lot of her material. She isn't an actress. She's taken her Twilight money and she's done some really interesting films to go along with it.
You have Underwater Eyes. She was great in that movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Personal Shopper, she's fantastic in. The Runaways, she's great in. So she's done some good stuff, and she is the highlight of this movie, particularly because she actually plays against type in this one as the comedic relief.
She's actually not only comedic relief, she's a fast-talking fun girl.
Right. She's like this kind of questionable. You never really know her real background. It seems like she's always kind of like a little bit lying at any given time.
Next Ocean's movie, I would totally be like, yeah, that tracks. They write her like that. She's like cool, like an Ocean's character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that she's easily the highlight of this movie, which is a problem simply because like I actually think the three women that are in the leads are good. They don't have the chemistry like the last two movies at all. And part of that is because they're introducing a new character to be the audience surrogate.
So remember that time I said something I specifically liked about the first two movies is that it's not an origin story?
Yeah. And this weirdly acts like one, and it, because it literally feels like it has to explain Charlie's organization, all of the Bosleys, enough to the point where like, and this is where it actually becomes a sequel, is that one sequence in it, they show all of the pictures of the previous Angels, including from the original TV show and the 2000s movies. But in that sequence, they replace Bosley, like it'll be a picture with Bill Murray, and they replace his head with Patrick Stewart's head in the background, which is so strange. It was like, okay, so you want to admit that these movies existed, but not the way that you remember them, that it's slightly different.
Bill Murray just not like okay his like image in the new film.
Well, even Bernie Mac's not in it or anything. Like those images are like replaced with Patrick Stewart, like they're photoshopped
it's
in.
A plot point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's baffling is what it is. It's like it wants to and
this movie makes clear I alluded to it earlier, but in this case Bosley is not a name, it is a rank within the Townsend agency, and it leads to some Bosley confusion, which is why I personally call this movie, and Matt has been tortured with this joke since it came out, Charlie's Angels, too many Bosleys.
The great Bosley confusion.
It's so true, because you're introduced, like at first you're introduced as Patrick Stewart as a Bosley, and then you're introduced to, and I'm going to slaughter his name, Djimon Hounsou.
Djimon Hounsou, I think.
I have no idea. I'm gonna butcher it because I butcher every name. I butcher my own name. My last name is Reifschneider. What?
Jimon Hansu.
Okay, I like that. I like what Thea said. He shows up as a Bosley, and then Elizabeth Banks shows up as a Bosley. We've got a whole kinds of Bosleys going on. It's so strange that they would do it that way because it's almost like they don't trust their audience had seen it, even though they're trying to play the nostalgic card. Mm-hmm. And which is where I actually think that the last two Charlie's Angels movies did it right. Was if you're going to do it that way, lean into it and be like, this is part of it. We had a cameo from original Charlie's Angels in Charlie's Angels Full Throttle in the bar sequence, which is its own problem in its own way. But I mean, she was there, so she's there for it. And I think that that's really interesting too. But this movie, it's a clusterfuck of plot. It's a thin plot, and none of it really gels together in a lot of ways.
No, the problem is they've gotten complacent because a lot of people see movies like Fast and Furious, and it seems like this big, dumb movie, and they think, oh, I can do that. Anybody can do that. You get enough people with enough charisma together, and you throw in some big, you throw in some big set pieces, and we got ourselves a pick. They miss the things that Fast and Furious does actually do well, and why I am a fan of that franchise, for example. Because, like you said, this movie feels like a bad Fast and Furious. It feels like a bad Mission Impossible. It feels like it's trying to use the elements without understanding why the elements work.
For sure. And the big angle for this film, which makes it interesting because this is where the first two films I feel like struggle a little bit, is that it really wants to take a feminist lens to this franchise. And then it proceeds to just beat you in the face with it. There is no subtlety to it whatsoever in terms of the dialogue or performances or what Elizabeth Banks has to say. It's not like it's just buried in there. It is literally somebody that is saying those lines to you. And as much as I hate that there's an audience out there that was like, man, female audiences, female-led movies, they all suck or whatever. And then this movie tries to take a right hook with you to it. And, in our Black Christmas episode, we talked about the new Black Christmas being kind of the sly feminist commentary that had some interesting stuff, even though it was over the top. I feel like this movie puts that to shame in terms of trying to really, really slather on a feminist, message to it. And I think it's going to rub people the wrong way. And when it comes out on home video, I'm really curious to see how a general audience who has not seen it reacts to what Elizabeth Banks has to say as both a writer and a director.
Whereas, on the other hand, I actually do think that it's clumsy, it's not subtle. At the same time, I made the joke about Reb Brown, but there are so many Reb Browns in the world, and there are so many rah, we want to be Chuck Norris. There's so much of that kind of crap in the world of action that I think whether or not I like this movie, which I really didn't, and I do think the feminism's a little in your face, but I do also think there's room in the cinema for that. And that's why I'm saying I get annoyed with the wrong people taking the wrong message out of it, because there's nothing wrong with representation. A bad movie's a bad movie's a bad movie. And I will always judge a movie on its own merit, but every group deserves their bad movies too.
I could agree with that. Yeah, I'll give you that. I appreciate that this movie did take a leap for that in a lot of ways, because it, if you're going to break boundaries, sometimes you have to be forceful with it. And I think that this movie tries to do it with it. I'm just not sure the Charlie's Angels franchise was the way to go about that.
Oh, certainly not. I just got up on my little soapbox there, but now I'm going to cut myself down with this movie is really bad. Just on a strict plot level. The characters are fun and the cameos are fun, and that's always going to be true. But I'm comparing it to Mission Impossible, but this is bad even for a bad Mission Impossible.
Yeah, and I haven't seen it since theaters. Obviously, it's not out quite yet, and hopefully it'll be out soon. So people who are listening to this can have a chance to go view it, because I think there's some interesting ideas in here. There's some like you said, some of the cameos work. I actually think Patrick Stewart's pretty good in this movie. I'm not sure why he took this movie. If particularly because, as we said, we're going to spoil things. He turns out to be the villain in the end of this film. I like him as a villain, but after you see him in Green Room or something like that, where he plays a Nazi, and you're like, that's an interesting role for him to take because it's so against character. And then this one is almost like, oh, look, it's Patrick Stewart, and then the twist is it's against character, and I don't think it works for me. But even though I think he's pretty good in it, so there's things in it that I like. I just think that this is a film that ultimately will just be forgotten, which as far as I'm concerned, like you said, a bad movie is a bad movie is a bad movie. But in the realm of cinema, I think there's only the greatest sin that you can ever commit is being unmemorable. And I think that that's what this movie ultimately does, despite some of its best efforts, is that it ends up just falling just straight in the middle of everything and never quite makes an impact on anything. Franchise analysis
is the themes of Charlie's Angels. What would you call a major theme for you, Thea?
Oh, you're catching me off guard. Can we round back to me?
Sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know what? I think for me, the big one is this. There's this idea that I think one of the biggest themes about it is the idea that it's building upon a continuity. I like that this is a franchise that builds upon itself. Even when the 2019 one starts to backtrack a little bit, at least it's building upon itself. It's not a strict reboot at any point. Or a strict remake at any point. It's a reboot, which I think is a really interesting way to approach it. And it's actually probably one of my favorite things about the franchise as a whole.
Okay, I've got mine. I don't know if this counts as a theme, but I'm going to say long, fun Spice Girls song. That's what the Charlie's Angels movie is to me.
That's fair. And actually ties into what I would say is a major theme, which is like I said earlier, it's that very, very specific late 90s, early aughts girl power feminism. And I actually think Spice Girls is the perfect comparison. That is exactly right. This is a Spice Girls music video extended out to 5 hours, give or take, all said.
We should have reviewed Spice World as part of this franchise.
Great film. I love that movie.
It's definitely my third favorite Meatloaf performance.
This is the most random. Do I want to know what's 1 and 2?
Well, you bet your sweet Bippy one of them's Black Dog. You should touch on that movie.
Oh God, I do love Black Dog. I forgot about that movie. Oh man, yeah. And I think the one other theme that obviously we touched on throughout the films as we talked about them was the feminist kind of slant to it. I mean, as much as I think a lot of them fail at it, there's an intent there to try to be empowering for women, to utilize what is as you said, a very gimmicky TV show to try to twist it in a modern way. I just think that even like the 2000s one are still a victim to their time period.
Say what you will about the male gaziness of it, and say what you will about what you will. It is one thing that happens over and over in the movie is that they are specifically underestimated for being women, and they do come out on top because of it every time. The only time they're ever really deeply threatened is by other women. Sam Rockwell's henchman in the first one, and obviously Demi Moore in the second. And I do think that's kind of interesting. But like you say, it's not... almost everything we could say about this, and especially in terms of connective ideas, is almost shit we're attributing to it, because this is very, very much throwing at the wall and seeing what sticks, and we're just picking up on what's sticking.
Right. Because even like one of the things I got really irritated with, especially with the second one in terms of that female empowerment, was that for whatever reason, all three of them have to have a romantic love interest.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the third one, they're like, there's an interesting idea about her always falling for the bad guy, which is used as a joke initially.
That is a pretty good joke.
Although, yeah, when she's like looking through the binoculars and she's like, he's hot, she's like, bad guy. Like, she only falls for the bad guys. So it's played for a joke at times. But then there's like the weird scene with Crispin Glover at the very end.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
God. Oh, what a terrible like third act twist. I'm glad that only lasted for about 6 seconds before Justin Theroux just like stabs him, knocks him right off that building. Can you imagine?
I'm not. Are you trying to imagine the characters or actually Drew Barrymore and Crispin Glover? Because both of them are kind of a terrifying combination.
Yeah,
Wait. Can I imagine sniffing Willard's hair and then making out with him for a second before he gets stabbed by
they got a
sexy
good
others?
kiss in there. Like, oh man.
That's a word for it.
It's like they did it. They had a fully realized romance within like 3 seconds, but then like that's all we needed, you know?
And that actually does weirdly bring up a weird point in the level of throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks, because there's a whole like kind of orphan and found family like subplot they really go for.
Mm-hmm.
It does not work, but they really go for it.
And particularly because like I feel like some of that is an excuse, because I think the idea between like John Cleese being Lucy Liu's dad is that the idea that she might have been adopted or something to that effect to go along with that idea. But like I feel like half of that was an excuse to put them in like high school outfits. Like you're like why are they cheerleaders? Why is this a thing?
If I can gush just one more moment, by the way, of all the little prequel scenes, Lucy Liu beating the crap out of that kid at chess is so funny to me, and I can't tell you why, but him just begging her, no, she's like, yes, boom.
I do get a good little laugh in every time they put them like in braces too, right? Like I don't know, there's just something funny about it. I think that they're good with physical comedy.
And I think it's the same headgear that they have poor Ben Stiller in Something About Mary. So funny to me.
But yeah, I like you said, I think that was like something that just kind of accidentally happened in this film, whether McG wanted it or not. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of interesting ideas present and themes in this franchise that I don't think any of the films actually like really grasp.
And as much as I was like speaking positive of the third one, to tie that into the whole conversation, the only theme of that movie is, look, get it, we're girls. Get it, we're doing all this stuff and we have boobs. Like, yeah, I get it. Just because I'm defending its right to exist, and I do appreciate the basic feminism and the basic equality of a bad feminist movie, doesn't mean I'm not saying it's a bad feminist movie.
Do you think that it's worse than the original 2 movies? Like, is it just terrible by today's standards, or is it just like...
No, I don't think this one's ever going to quite pick up the cult status. Because Charlie's Angels, in a very, very large way, and maybe I'm only drawing this comparison because I watched them very, very recently, but it's sort of female Bad Boys in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got a lot of the same pitfalls, and I've got a lot of the same problems with both movies, especially in the sense of editing and pace and... Jesus, take a breath and have a dialogue for a second. But
which is funny because we've had a few requests now for us to cover the Bad Boys movies now that the third one came out. So that might be something we have to tackle sooner or later, which I know you just rewatched them. So maybe I should just rewatch them, which I kind of cringe at because I really do feel like Bad Boys 1 and 2 aged like gorilla farts in the sun. But
which is what's funny, because there are things about the Charlie's Angels films that aged kind of well. Again, the feeling of fun to it all, they're just fun movies. It's hard to watch them without getting a smile on your face.
Right. Which is like when I started rewatching the first one, like I don't think the first one is a good movie, but like as I was rewatching it, I was like, at least I understood. I get why people like this movie. And, you know, as much as you said, like the new 2019 movie may not find its cult audience with time, sometimes I'm shocked by what movies find an audience over time, like what movies get reclaimed as good movies, even if they were seen as bad movies. I mean, this is a day and age where the movie Valentine has suddenly reclaimed an audience as a slasher film, and I think that movie's terrible. Oh. Yes, David Boreanaz says, yeah, I like how that's the one person you remember. But I mean, movies get reclaimed all the time now, and it's, you know, because you do run that kind of like that, you know, 20-30 year cycle where, you know, people who grew up with those movies get it reclaimed, and it makes you wonder that if in 20 years the Charlie's Angels will actually weirdly find an audience, the new one, the 2019, just like these first two found an audience with time.
It'll probably be me. I'll probably like this movie.
We'll have to add an update once you see it. You'll be like, we'll do a little ticker tape add-on.
Because if I learned anything in the course of this podcast, and here's just the arrogance of being the protagonist of your own life story, but like I think of the movies I grew up watching over and over and over again, and Charlie's Angels would have never even registered as one of those movies. But like, it's kind of cool to realize that like some girls just watch it at a slumber party every couple weeks.
Yeah, it was this and Bring It On back to back. You guys really missed out. I think my experience trumps yours.
I have nothing. So, guest first, what would you call your best and worst for these three movies?
I don't necessarily know that it's fair for me to rank them, considering I have not seen the third. But even like having heard so many opinions about 2019's Charlie's Angels, I think that it's probably going to fall somewhere in the middle. So I feel fairly confident in saying 2000, for better or worse, is my favorite film, and Full Throttle is probably my least.
For you, Sean, what's rank yours?
Actually, chronological 1-2 remake, or 1-2 2019 rather.
No shit. See, I got to go with Thea here. I got to go 2000 as my favorite. Second favorite as the 2019 reboot. And then the third one being Full Throttle, because I think Full Throttle is a fucking disaster. It's a landmine as of a film.
It is, and it is a complete disaster piece. But on the other hand, it's memorable.
Fair enough.
For all the wrong reasons, it's memorable.
So I think that about does it for the Charlie's Angels franchise. For now, who knows when that sequel hits?
With the $8 million opening weekend, I think Charlie's Angels is going to be like a locust, and for 17 years is going to go underground for a while, and then it'll eventually come back. I actually do think it'll eventually come back.
I'll be there when it does.
You're going to make one. Start doing fanfic. Yeah, I like it. So yeah, that kind of ends our Charlie's Angels episode for that. I mean, overall, it was kind of fun to revisit these. I actually thought that this was kind of a fun experiment. I'm glad that our listeners out there had requested them. We're happy to do that. So if anybody else out there in podcast world decides, if there's something else, like I said, we've gotten some requests for other franchises, including Bad Boys. So hopefully we can get onto that as soon as we can. Now that the third one is out, as of the recording of this one.
Oh, and believe me, I have opinions about Bad Boys.
Do you, Sean?
The film and just boys who are bad.
That's true. I mentioned Supernatural. That's some Bad Boys.
You just brought it back to Supernaturally.
I will find any goddamn excuse to bring it back to Supernatural. I really, really actually love that show.
Well, thank you everybody for listening once again. This has been No Franchise Fatigue. I am Matt. I've been joined by Sean and Thea. Thank you for coming, Thea.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a really fun time. And I enjoyed talking with y'all. So I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. If you guys are interested, you can find Sean and I both write at bloodbrothersfilmreviews.blogspot.com. You can also check us out on all of our social media. You can find us on Twitter at NFFpod. That is the @ NFFpod. And then you can reach us on Facebook at facebook.com/No Franchise Fatigue Podcast. And then also you can, what's your email again, Sean, if you have any fan requests?
Would be nffpod.sean, SEAN. My name is a 4-letter word, at gmail.com.
I call you a bunch of 4-letter words, but that's all off the air. So, but thank you once again, everybody, for listening to us. What do we got up next? We've got...
Next is going to be Good, Bad, Weird, Wild of Vin Diesel.
Oh, yes. The Diesel Man. I love it. So, and for our next Franchise Fatigue podcast, we're going to be heading back into the well with The Ring Part 2. All's well that ends well, by well for well's sake. Yep. So we definitely will be heading back to the well for all of the American Ring films. So we're going to be watching The Ring. We're going to be watching Ring 2, and that's spelled out TWO. Thanks, stupid titling gimmicks. And then we'll be tackling Rings, the most latest American film. And then also as a bonus portion of this podcast, we'll be tackling The Ring Virus, which is the Korean remake of Ring which is in itself a pretty fascinating film. So I'm excited to be tackling that one next. All right. Thank you guys for listening. We hope you have a great evening. And as always, don't forget, keep watching your franchises and always vote for your best sequel. All right. Thanks.